then you edit after that. Yeah, sure, of course. Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
Okay. Well, welcome to CIC. I'm here today with Gwenael Kerlidou, who's a fellow artist here in New York, who's exhibited across the Atlantic, and he's also a writer. And while there's a number of writers in the art world, there's only a select few that I tend to pay attention to on a regular basis, and it would be Gwen's work. Today I'd like to talk with him about what I call a trilogy of articles that Gwenael's written about James Bishop. The most recent one, its title is James Bishop, an American Hermit in Blevy. And it was, on the occasion of his most recent show here in New York. It was a very interesting article, and it led me to two articles that I was able to follow up on with your helpful links. And the article was to your Hyperallergic articles in 2015, which talked about his Bram
Van Velde.
Right.
This
Dutch artist,
right,
who has a very kind of way, I don't know if colorful is the right way to say it, but yes, it is colorful literally to his work, but also in literary terms and the associations and the kind of edge of obscurity and the heights of fame that an artist can exist in simultaneously.
Right.
And so all this is very interesting also, but the part that I really want to get to the heart of, and you've expressed this notion both in this article most recently and back in 2015, was about our art worlds across the Atlantic, Europe's point of view, if that could be said, and America's point of view, if that could be said. I'm talking really about New York. We're talking really about New York
right,
and France. You put it in a very kind of succinct way most recently, but you referred to it again previously in 2015 and put it very well again. But there's this fundamental difference, a very stark difference. One is very kind of closed down, and you associated with Greenberg, and that kind of linear thinking in a certain way, and a kind of open-endedness of the Europe/French approach to modern art, to painting,
right,
to contemporary art.
Yeah, yeah.
That goes from Europe's version of abstract expressionism would be
La forme.
right.
But it's not really the equivalent. I don't think it could be said as the equivalent, because abstract expressionism actually takes its root before in pre-war abstraction, and l'informel, as we say in French, is a result of the post-war situation. So it's totally different. So, and what I've been trying to say in some of the articles there is that there is this, this discrepancy between how Greenberg and after him, a lot of American critics and thinkers and historians thought about modern art and the European way, which is kind of fundamental and which doesn't seem to be that well perceived or recognized or analyzed, certainly not. And which is that, modern art for the Europeans has never been a done deal. And at some point, Greenberg comes to Europe, goes back to the US, and considers European modern art as a done deal. For Europeans, it's always been a work in progress. Even after the war, when all those young American painters came to Paris thinking this was the mecca of modern art, they were in a situation, I think I said that in another article about that exhibition of young painters in Paris, that they were in a context where communism actually was more powerful politically, aesthetically, philosophically and all that, than could ever recognized in the US because at the same time we were in the US under the McCarthy law, so there was this, and for Greenberg, the Europe had said what it had to say on modern art, and you could infer from all of that, what you would call modernism, and come out with a theory that would become reductive and formalist and all that, and in the end, drive us to a dead end, to a wall. When in Europe, it was always a very tentative thing. There was always this battle. I mean, even as Americans thought that modern art was definitely established, and you could draw a linear sort of evolution from it. It was never an acquired. It was never a settled battle in Europe. It was always an ongoing battle.
I've always associated this with a kind of what I thought before, and I might change my mind given your response now, as an eschatology that's buried deep in the Western sort of mindset that drives us toward the last painting, as in...
I think that's a result of Greenberg's, I think it's once you've got this theory that from the past you can infer the future, which never came to mind to any European. You had to have the distance of the Atlantic in between, to be enough distance with that scene to be able to draw from the past this kind of, radical theory that, yes, the future could be inferred from the past, even though that future, as Greenberg saw it, excluded from its reading half of modern art, and for example, surrealism. It was completely absent from Greenberg's vision of modernism. Mm-hmm. How can you explain that? How can you possibly, expand the history of modern art into modernism with the exclusion of not half, but a good portion of what actually made it modern?
So maybe it's not just fault of character, the American character. At least it's a politics of art.
Yeah.
Of Greenberg
I think the whole thing is actually
the Museum of Modern Art getting on its legs
but
at the same time.
even more than that, we're talking about communism and the McCarthy era. I think what happened, and I think I've sort of touched on that, but maybe not developed it enough, is so after the war in Europe, you have a situation. Very different situation in the US. Basically the US is in an economic boom, and Europe is under reconstruction. So everything in Europe has to be rearticulated with the background fact that the idealist philosophy that sustained European art until the Second World War is no longer possible because of the Holocaust. How can you continue to think in the same terms?
No poetry after Auschwitz, then.
Exactly. Well, it's not just poetry. It's like no philosophy, no painting, no anything, right?
Yeah, it's an expansive notion.
So there is this huge consciousness in Europe of the impossibility of that old set of values, to be used, and that's what sort of generates what we now call post-structuralism. One of the main factors that allowed for the rethinking of the idealist philosophical precepts, which permitted or allowed the Holocaust to happen in Europe, was that the idea of interdisciplinarity in the social sciences in Europe. So it's the idea that, for example, in structuralism, anthropology could have an effect on linguistics, and so on and so on. All the fields were actually impacted by the advances in one particular field. You know, they reflected on each other, they impacted on each other, and all that. When in the US, it was the opposite. It was a rigidifying of the specificity of each field, and which is exactly what Greenberg wanted. You know, the specificity of painting in this field, and you know, the flatness being the logical end of modern art. You know, come on, you know.
Distinctions.
The specificity, this idea of specificity, going back to Kant, you know, going back to idealism again, to shore up this theory, you know, which was, you know, that idealism, as European, German, and French and idealism, was rejected by, you know, the post-war generation in Europe. So here it's specificity, but how did this idea of a specific field or specific fields that don't communicate with each other take root? And I think that's why it took root, because of the McCarthyist era. Because in the departments of philosophy after the war in the US, you could not possibly bring up Marx and Freud as valid topics of investigation. So you had to sort of like close off your field onto its own specific field. So that's when actually that schism between continental philosophy and analytical philosophy starts, you know, showing up. So, you know, on one side, and that's why, you know, sort of like the Americans loved Wittgenstein, but they couldn't see Lacan. They couldn't understand Lacan. Why is that? Because Wittgenstein was about, you know, self specificity and
referentiality,
and referentiality, you know, the circularity of thought and all that, which is interesting, but up to a point. When it ends with, like Greenberg, with the idea that, you know, abstraction or painting closes onto itself by sort of expressing its nature in flatness, you're already talking about the last painting right there.
Kind of
so all of this is really, you know, a whole set of ideas that are coming out of historical circumstances, but that are lived in totally different ways on both sides of the Atlantic. You know, that's why suddenly, you know, in the 60s, you have something like BMPT and Support Surface that come out of this criticism of the School of Paris, when they barely knew about the abstract expressionists, which was...
And the School of Paris being Art Informal?
No. The School of Paris was, you know, what people don't really talk about it that much here, but there was a whole bunch of painters who were very successful, you know, like my father's generation, were after the war sort of like trying to actualize the heritage of Cubism and Fauvism. So Cubism for structure, Fauvism for color, and ended up being, you know, sort of abstract landscape painters, which was still connected to the idealistic philosophy of the rootedness of a people to its land. You know, when in the US, actually the experience of the abstract expressionist painters interpreting or, you know, reading modern art in Europe was an experience of unrootedness, you know, being unrooted. So that's where the discourses go. Greenberg doesn't come into play yet, but if you look at Rothko, de Kooning, Gorky, they all come from different places. They settled in the U.S., so they have this experience of being unrooted. And you know, in Europe there was the same thing. You know, Picasso was from Spain. You know, lots of people were from all over Europe. But the discourse of the School of Paris was still very much rooted in the idea of the land, the idea of culture and the land being one thing, you know, territory. territorial. It was very
And
territorial.
I hate to say it, but doesn't it have like the old Nazi fascist root thing with the
Here we go. So we're not very
blood
close.
and soil kind of thing?
We're-
But we're talking
exactly.
about post-war, though.
Well, it was
How
like the
did that-
last remnants.
The Vichy France thing or something?
There were not Vichy. I don't think anybody would be making excuses for Vichy, but philosophically, they were still thinking those terms, Heideggerian terms. When Heidegger talks about Van Gogh's clogs, he talks about the soil. He talks about how the painter is connected to the soil, and it's like it was still out there. It had not been its criticism had not been formulated clearly yet. It was being formulated. It's at the same time that Foucault comes out with his first books, and Deleuze and all those people. But back then, the impact of those thinkers was limited to a very small circle of people.
Bishop, before he travels to Europe, he studies history. I'd like to know more about that. Also, when he goes to Europe, he travels not just to France, but to Italy to study.
Pre-Renaissance or earlier Renaissance, painters. Yeah.
And you write about a regard for history, its differences across the Atlantic, but also a kind of influences of the Surrealist to Motherwell that leads us all the way through in Bishop's painting
Right.
to provisional painting, but also across the Atlantic, influences admitted by him in conversation with you in 2015 of Bram
Bram van Velde.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's all very interesting. And those associated connections to Beckett.
Yeah.
Samuel, who is a kind of a mentor to Bram van Velde. And,
more like a friend and somebody, a kindred spirit. Is that the right word?
A collector.
A collector, but a kindred spirit.
Right.
A kindred spirit, more like than a mentor.
Also, Bram van Velde is also could be an inspiration for Beckett's work.
He is actually
A character.
He is totally an inspiration, and I'm not a specialist of that, and lots of books have been written about that actually. But one of Beckett's first texts on painting, it's called Le Monde et le Pantalon, the world and the pants, and the pair of pants, and it's about the two Beckett brothers, but Bram's brother, Ger, is not very well known and is also more of a School of Paris type of painter, more traditional than Bram was. Bram was really unique in that sense. He was coming out of that School of Paris, but sort of like took it in a direction that nobody else did. And, which is fairly close to what some abstract expressionists would do. Not necessarily Guston, but you think, the kind of interrogation that Guston, for example, has about his own work, maybe 20 years later, is fairly close to what, Van Velde went through in the 40s. Expressed differently, different contexts.
But a volte-face against...
Not necessarily a volte-face, because there was no volte-face in Van Velde.
We have a fire department right next door, Gwen's studio, which is great, actually. So.
Not necessarily a volte-face, but definitely a deep questioning of why I'm doing this and why I'm doing it this way.
Now take us to history and the Quattrocento and the influences on Bishop.
Right.
And I think this story will take us through support surfaces.
Right.
Devane is his name. the artist, one of the members of Support Surface, who emphasis of color was in a way influenced by Bishop's work.
Yeah, definitely.
And
Yeah.
so we're talking about Italian painting,
Right.
filtering its memory through.
I don't know if I would necessarily put it like that. I mean, what you're referring to is not really my take. It's Maurice Pleynet, because in that article on
Which you translated.
right, I included and incorporated a translation of Maurice Pleynet's seminal critical approach of Bishop, and he is the one who actually sort of like puts the emphasis on the difference between Bishop's and his American contemporaries, if you want, in underlying the fact that Bishop was also interested in art history, was a student and a teacher of art history, and was particularly interested in early Quattrocento painting, Italian painting.
And what about his history in graduate or undergraduate school before he left the United States?
Well, I'm not sure I know too much about it.
Was it art history, I assume?
No, I guess he was probably following some classes of art history as well. I think what left an impression on him was his time at Black Mountain College, where he had Motherwell as a teacher, apparently.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. I didn't know it was that direct, but...
Yeah, I mean, if I remember it correctly. But the influence of Motherwell, kept creeping up in his work up until pretty much the 60s, which is something that's not really examined that much. So to me, the fact that he paid attention to Motherwell's work meant that he was open to accept the principle that surrealism still had some validity. Not surrealism as it is understood here in the US as generation of the idea of generating images, but the principle of surrealism that Maurice Pleynet is talking about, which is automatic writing and psychic automatism. That's the real engine behind surrealism, the way it was understood by Motherwell, and I imagine the way Motherwell taught that.
And what do you think Bishop took from that? What was his...
So he took the idea, I mean, we can see that the painting gesture is imbued with, some kind of mark of the unconscious. And so even though it could be like he did in his work from the 70s, within the grid, within all that, the gesture, and that's the whole idea of the pouring paint, the way he does it, which is very different from Maurice Lewis or Frankenthaler. It's imbued with some kind of subjectivity, with a very, very present subjectivity. And that's what Devad picked up on, in his work, is that the actual gesture doesn't have to be a gesture separated from color. Color is its own gesture.
Right.
Devad was one of the main theoreticians, if not the main theoretician of support surface. I mean, support surface sort of like didn't last too long, but after they sort of split up, Devad and Kahn, Marc Devad and Louis Kahn, who lived in Paris, both had studios in the same building, sort of like launched this magazine that was called Peinture Cahier Théorique, which was full of texts, very interesting. First translations in French of Greenberg, for example, first publication of Pleynet's, and their own texts on painting, which are very interesting. They're also very dated politically, because they were Maoist, and that can't be defended anymore. But their views on painting was incredibly progressive. And so, in terms of how to approach color, Devad definitely took his cues directly from Bishop.
And I understood, perhaps primitively, that support services were a kind of deconstruction of the West in a way. a kind
Well,
of
okay,
pulling the
so
linchpin apart and letting things fall. But
so
color, how does embracing color, maybe I don't understand support surface. Maybe that's what I'm trying to listen
right,
from you.
right. Well,
A
it's
better
complicated
understanding.
and complex and conflicted. Color in support surface, it's kind of interesting because not too many other support surface artists are interested in color, but de Waard is so interested that he actually produces a number of texts on color, and he's on that topic and a few others also very very close conceptually to Marcelin Pleynet. Both of them were working or very close to Tel-Quel circles. Tel-Quel was a periodical of an intellectual life in France, directed by Philippe Solers, who was a writer, a novelist. So, I mean, the discussion between the literary people and the art people was constantly ongoing. That's what I go back to interdisciplinarity, one informed the other, the thinking about...
More so than America here?
Oh, immensely more so. I mean, there's no comparison. There's not, that dialogue doesn't exist here. Yeah, between literary figures and artistic and painters and artists. It doesn't exist here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where in that short period, the period between the creation of Tel-Quel and the end of Tel-Quel in the 80s, was the moment, which is, the same moment as that all the seminal texts of what we now call post-structuralism, sort of are written. That's a moment, that's a unique moment in the history, not just of French culture, but European culture, which was actually never recognized here or never acknowledged or even,
until
suscitated
2012 or something.
any interest until, 30 years later, until some text,
Which points to the first thing we're talking about, which is that sort of divide across the Atlantic, divide in understanding, divide in history, and a kind of strange because I love New York. I think it's the best dialogue I found in the world right now. The people, I'm full of that New York pride as well. It's a bit obnoxious because there's cities in Houston, Los Angeles, and Chicago, great cities, and I'm sure in other cities, I don't want to shortchange them. But New York's the best of them all. Of course, we're New Yorkers would say that. But in that kind of pride comes a kind of blindness, in a way, and maybe that's what's operating here too. That we think we don't need to know about developments in France.
There was definitely,
and support services wasn't getting attention for that reason, or was there other reasons?
I mean, if we want to talk about support surface, it's a different topic, but it was a very conflicted and antagonized moment in a way that it actually sort of like antagonized most of the people around the art world in France at that moment, while it was creating a very interesting alternative to young painters like me, just coming out of art school when I discovered the support surface. An alternative to the humanist, idealist discourse of the Second School of Paris.
Okay.
What I call the Second School of Paris, the Second School of Paris after the Second World War.
Okay.
Those abstract landscape painters. So it was an alternative to that. But they were also sort of rejecting politically and everything, so many things that they didn't want to be part of, that it sort of like brushed people in the wrong direction so much that they, the minute they dissolved, basically the French institution wanted to forget about them. And most of them actually sort of like came out of, most of the artists came out of their support surface period and moved into different styles. So but the impact of that moment, that support surface moment between 68 and 72 was so strong that it reverberated even 30 years later here with young painters in the 90s and the the early thousands. With painters who were just rediscovering that, and finally finding some kind of affinities with the thinking of support surface.
I'd love to ask you so many more things about this topic, but this is a whole other video as well.
It is, yeah.
And I'd like to get to sublimation. So we were speaking of sublimation, and I was tracking it through a number of different things. I think it ultimately goes to his touch, his use of color, the use of oil versus acrylic that you mentioned in the article.
Right.
Ultimately, through Bram van Velde to Beckett, and then to this writer, Maurice Pleynet.
Right.
Who wrote, at least I saw a book review on YouTube or something like that.
Right.
It was very impressive.
Right.
But it was all about indeterminacy,
right.
about not allowing rest in a certain sense. That in this book, it was about being both alive and dead.
Right.
And it was written in such a beguiling way that you could never sort of rest in the sort of certainty of what the book is telling you, and
right.
yet the ride itself is kind
right.
of like life, where you
right.
never get that. We live with uncertainty for
right.
the entirety of our lives. So the way the book is very true to life, but then it's very frustrating in the sense that it's indeterminate.
Yeah,
this goes to sublimation and touch and color.
Yeah, I'm not so sure I see a connection with Blanchot, and I mean, the reason I mentioned Blanchot in speaking about Bishop is that Blanchot was very well known in French circles for being a recluse, for being somebody who disappeared, who basically was about self-effacement. And there seemed to be the same kind of character going on with Bishop, where the more you try to pin him down as a painter, as either an American painter or a French painter, or a precursor of support surface or all that, the more you would withdraw and sort of like want to take his distance. For the little I know of him, he was very good at deflecting questions and not wanting to respond directly. I asked him a couple of questions, and he basically avoided them very, very skillfully each time.
On the ride over here, we were talking about a friend who will not be named, who's also reticent, to be pinned down in conversation about his work. But I also think about famous artists like Warhol or, Duchamp, who was, elliptical, a word you used a couple of times in your third article in this trilogy. There's something about, but this is built into Bishop's personality. I mean, other artists, not so inclined, are famous about writing effusively and definitively about their intentions and what they're doing, And I want to get to that. I'm trying to bridge that.
Yeah,
the attitude and the touch.
Yeah, I'm not sure I know enough about it. I'm just an outside spectator to it, and I sort of became aware of his work when he was shown in the 70s when I was a student in France. Not necessarily understanding back then what I was seeing. It took a few years to wrap my head around it. And Bishop's figure was also a presence on the Paris scene back in those days. And he was super well regarded by all the intellectuals that matter to me, so. I mean, to me, he's interesting because he's a good example of what didn't happen, what could have happened in the dialogue between Europe and the US, and led in the end, I think, to this dead end that we're in, of being neither modernist nor postmodernist, because all of these names, these definitions have run their course and sort of lost their purpose.
It's a reigning theme now. I mean, we see it everywhere. The Whitney Biennial, all the reviews I've seen so far speak to that. The problem of the moment being so, we can't pin anything down. It's
right, right. I think everybody can feel it.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, Bishop was a good example of somebody who could actually navigate both sides and managed to navigate both sides. Managed to develop his work in a completely not American context, while, and that's probably part of the issues he was having with Pleynet as a couple, is that Pleynet had very, very clear ideas of what, a little bit like Greenberg, of what art should be. And you know, he pushed a number of people, you know, notably, for example, Antai, to become part of Support Surface, and you know, I think Bishop didn't want to have anything to do with it, and neither did Antai. So you know, he wanted to stay, you know, apart from it, you know, not being part of it. So there was this, you know, wanting not to belong, to take from both sides what he could, what he needed to grow as an artist, but not be part of any specific scene. Which I thought was, you know, a very, very interesting and relevant position to have.
This sounds like a great place to end.
Okay.
Unless we can keep going for a long time.
Right.